This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London FinTech Podcast, episode 183, brought to you in association with Smart Pension and the enlistedboard.com, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Yusuf Ozdalga, partner at QED Investors, to talk about what kind of value add most helps founders and their companies. Or, metaphorically speaking, what sun, what rain, and what compost will make your trees fruit better and faster. QED Investors is a leading VC firm focused on investing in the early stage, hence their deep knowledge of what works in growing seedlings. They are in the US, the UK and Latin America, have made over 120 investments, including an amazing 19 eventual unicorns. Notable investments include Credit Karma, ClearScore and SoFi. Yusuf leads QED's investments in the UK and Europe with a focus on payments, lending, financial infrastructure and proptech. As we've heard on the show once or twice before, all VCs claim to add value, yet, surprise, surprise, surveys show that founders/CEOs say that for most VCs, all the value arrived on the day when the check was cashed. However, as we shall hear later, QED, with their early stage focus, have spent quite some time creating an infrastructure specifically to provide the necessary added values. But first, what are the value adds that make the difference? What are the equivalents of the metaphorical sun, rain and compost for the startup seedling? Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good afternoon, Yusuf. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Thank you very much, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
And you've got many admirable traits, one or two which we may mention a bit later, but one of them you had at birth, which is that Ozdalga is Turkish name.
Yes, that's correct. So my heritage is Swedish-Turkish. My mom is actually Swedish, my dad is Turkish. I grew up in both countries, but predominantly in Turkey, so definitely an interesting mix of two European cultures as I grew up.
And so are you pretty fluent in three languages?
Yeah, I mean, my native languages are Swedish and Turkish, and I guess English is my third language, but I guess the fluency you can judge for yourself here. So hopefully I don't mess it up too badly today.
Well, it's super impressive. As most people find, the Brits have many weaknesses, and one of which is appalling, is that our school system, I mean, I learnt French for 5 years, and I can basically order a beer and chips, and that's it. It's just appalling trying to learn languages over here. But one thing I'm not sure I've mentioned on the show before, and the relevance in this context of Turkey, is that, as listeners may not know, or as you may not know yourself, the ancient Anatolian city of Kanesh, which is today's, apologise for my Turkish pronunciation, which I'm sure it isn't as good as yours, Kultepe. We know more about business in Kultepe, or in ancient Kanesh, 2000 BC, than anywhere in the entire world until 1000 AD. Even we know more about business in ancient Anatolia 4,000 years ago than in the Roman Empire, extraordinarily enough, because some 20-odd thousand clay tablets from private merchants' houses were found buried there quite some time later, and actually still up to this time actually are being found. And so we get a fascinating picture. In passing, if anyone's a complete nerd, they can buy a book called Ancient Kanesh, a merchant colony in Bronze Age Anatolia, which will explain all about it. But when I was researching the history of the company, I was amazed to find, because we think we're so clever today, we think we're such business people in the 21st century, that everything you associate with business, apart from one or two things, existed 4,000 years ago. Return on capital, investments, their version of VCs, foreign exchange, being able to send letters over thousands of miles across Turkey and ancient Assyria. The main thing that didn't exist, but it was probably better off for it, an entirely different conversation, is limited liability. But otherwise, pretty much everything you're going to talk on the show today about, people were talking about and writing about 4,000 years ago in Kultepe, which is pretty phenomenal.
That's correct, Mike. Yeah, in one of my blogs, which I entitled 21st Century Lending, I make a reference to the first known loans made which according to my research, which probably is quite limited, was made by the Sumerians more than 4,000 years ago. And the Sumerian king Hammurabi had actually legislated to, control interest rates. So you can think of those as the first usury or anti-usury laws. So I think lending, to kind of support your point there, goes back more than 4 millennia, which is pretty interesting. And today at QED, a lot of our investments obviously are in lending. And we've seen how lending has evolved since the 80s and 90s at Capital One to the 21st century today. But it's very, very interesting to put that into a historical context dating back 4 millennia.
Yes, exactly. And also equity investments and structures to wrap up the investments and stuff like that. So it is quite fascinating. Now, I mentioned your many attributes. It would be a long show to include them all. But one of the more curious ones, not entirely related to business 4,000 years ago, is that you're from a bit further east in terms of traditions, a jiu-jitsu medalist. What was that all about?
Yeah, jiu-jitsu is a great sport. It's a contact sport, obviously, but it is also non-violent. So it's grappling. There is no striking. I like to think about it as chess on the mat. It is a very strategic sport, and it takes a very long time to master. I'm really at the very beginning of that journey, but I've been in some competitions, and I joined my first competition after the age of 40, actually. So that should tell you something about my level of competence. But I did get a bronze medal at the Abu Dhabi Grand Slam, which is a pretty competitive event. But I was lucky that there was only 3 people in my age and weight category, so that helped me get the bronze.
I see. And I thought back in the day when I was bit more involved in martial arty things, jiu-jitsu was Japanese. But then more recently, the last decade or so, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is, I don't know, a cross between jiu-jitsu and capoeira or something like that, suddenly got very fashionable, and everybody in London's doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So very briefly, how does that sort of family work and lineages?
Yeah, I mean, jiu-jitsu is an offshoot of judo in Japan. And then the Gracie family basically took it to Brazil in the mid-20th century, and they started developing it, and it started gaining traction, I think, in the 70s, 80s, and then the big breakout happened in the 90s in the US, and a lot of that was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The really thesis of it goes back to using techniques to be able to master an opponent that's much, much bigger than yourself. And in that context, I think there's a lot of parallel with startups today, because most startups take on opponents or competitors that are much bigger than themselves. So having some jiu-jitsu skills is actually pretty natural for most startups. And even if they don't think about it as jiu-jitsu skills, in fact, I know that most startups today have to employ the business version of jiu-jitsu skills to win in the marketplace.
I like that. I see what you did there. You've managed to flow very professionally. You should be a podcaster. I think off the top of my head, Akira Kurosawa's first film was about one of the founders of judo or jiu-jitsu, or what it was all sort of splitting off in this kind of Asian way into various families, actually, which was quite interesting. I've entirely forgotten the name, actually. Anyway, I'm getting off the sort of narrow topic, it being after lunch here, of, as you say, startups and what it takes. Before we dive into that, maybe you could give the audience a little bit of a feel of your career journey, how you went from where you were to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I studied finance and MIS in college at the University of Virginia in the US. And, it was a hard choice for me. So I was trying to think, which one should I study? Finance, which I was very interested in, money, economics, and all those things, versus MIS, which was database management, database design. And then I realized I could actually do both. So that was a good choice. It was a bit of hard work at some points, but definitely worth it. And it actually led me to Capital One, because Capital One had just IPO'd a couple of years ago as I was graduating in the late 90s. And they were based very close to my university in Virginia at the time. And they were very much combining finance and MIS. So they were using data mining to drive better marketing decisions and better credit decisions. And they were using those big relational databases that were, for the first time in history, becoming available. And they were using those to do credit cards. So I thought that was a great combination for me. Capital One at that point was more like a scale-up. We were probably tripling or doubling every year. So it was a great time to join it. As I said, it was about 3 years after the IPO when I joined. And it was a great journey because I could use all those skills and be part of an amazing team and amazing leadership at that point, and see the company grow. And I was there for about 4 years until 2001, at which point it started becoming more and more like a bank. And I left at that point, did my MBA, but then joined JP Morgan, where Capital One became a client. So now I got to see Capital One from a very different perspective, from a capital markets perspective, which I had no appreciation of up to that point. I helped them with M&A, buying a bank, their first big bank acquisition. So it was a really good 360 picture of Capital One. With JP Morgan, I then came to London for family reasons, to be close to my Swedish and Turkish family. And here I joined Lehman's principal investing team, which we're basically investing or building lenders. So I did that for many years until the great 2008 cataclysmic collapse. As you know, I was there definitely with front row seats to that event, so lots of stories there. And after that, I started my own company, which was probably one of the most enjoyable things and also one of the most difficult things I've done. Got married, unrelated to starting my company, or perhaps only indirectly related. And then went into growth PE, and then came back full circle with the folks that had set up Capital One in the early days. First and foremost, Nigel Morris, who was a co-founder, but many of the people who worked with him in those days, to join QED. And I set up QED's UK presence here 4 years ago. We'd been investing in the UK quite a lot before in any case, but I was the sort of first person to be permanently based on the ground. And since then, I've been here.
Oh, I see. I'd forgotten, if I knew it at all, the connection between QED and Capital One. And I was just talking to someone today about this, actually, in terms of the history of fintech. There's an odd phenomena, which is that people seem to get younger, or there are lots more young people than there used to be. When I was young, there weren't so many young people. Now, for some reason, there are lots. And you and I might know what Capital One is and its importance, but actually there'll probably be plenty of people listening to the podcast who, for the sake of argument, weren't even born when Capital One started, or were still at school when Capital One was going up exponentially. Anyway, so moving on from that, you've clearly crossed the boundaries or been up the whole growth curve from sort of micro co to small to medium to larger. But before we get into the more nuanced perspective in terms of what firms and what founders need along that curve, just in terms of my simple metaphor of sun, rain and compost are very helpful for fruit trees, what do you think the sort of main value adds that founders need based on your direct experience of having done it?
That's a very good question. And thanks for pointing out the Capital One connection there. We think of Capital One as the first fintech, but you can have many claimants to that title. But in our view, we were definitely one of the first ones, and today valued at about 50 billion or so. I haven't checked recently. Yeah, I mean, I think what founders need is the core of QED, really. So when Nigel Morris, Frank Rotman set up QED, they wanted to differentiate QED in many ways. And that ethos has survived up to today, 14 years later. And the main thing that we chose was focusing on founders. And then to focus on founders is basically to mean how can we add value to founders? And then that goes back full circle, comes to us. What can we do differently that really helps founders? And then we realized a few key things. So one is we had to make a pretty hard choice that you can play a traditional VC game where you do a lot of investments and hope that some work out. Not to say that all our investments work out, but I will definitely say that a higher proportion of our investments tend to make it, quote unquote. And that's probably because we do less of them and spend time with them much, much more at an early stage. And that 0 to 1 stage is a very crucial stage in a company's life. They're very vulnerable. Things that you don't know about, the unknown unknowns can come and hurt you. And collectively at QED, as we've been doing this for some of us 20 years, some of us 40 years, we have a lot of battle scars, and we have not all of them, but at least some of those unknowns figured out, and we can help the founders. And that's not to say that other VCs cannot do that, but if you are on 15 or 20 boards, it becomes a lot more harder to do that. And then the tendency very easily becomes to just show up to the board meeting and say, share your expertise or share increase revenue, decrease costs, whatever it is. We try to spend a lot of time with the companies outside of board meetings as well. And we feel like to make that happen, we make a big sacrifice, which is we do less deals. And that has implications for us, as you can imagine. It's a hard choice to make, but we choose to do that. So that's the first thing we do.
So just on that one, a typical VC fund might have 10 to 15 investments and hope sort of one knocks the ball out of the park and another couple do okay and the others go bust. What would you say the random stats are for the industry as a whole compared to your fund and how many invest?
Yeah, I mean, it really varies across time and it really varies across a lot of funds. I have a lot of statistics of QED. I think we've had a particularly good run in the last 5-6 years. In general, if you look across the 14 years we've been investing, I think it's been close to 140 or so investments we've made. About 2/3 of them actually make it into some shape or form. Some of those obviously become unicorns. So we have 19 unicorns out of those investments, which is a good statistic and a good track record in terms of what we've been able to accomplish and what the founders have been able to accomplish. But in general, 2/3, even if they're not unicorns, do make it into something. And something that could be a 500 million exit, which is still very formidable, but not a unicorn. Sometimes that could be a 40 million exit, but if you got in early enough, that's a decent enough outcome for us and a great outcome sometimes for the founder.
Yeah, so, I mean, just putting that to context, in a recent podcast on angel investing, Richard Hargreaves, who's got a few decades of experience, I think it was something like 1/3 of your investments give you some money back. In your case, 2/3 do. In your case, just under 15% actually turn into a unicorn, which is astronomical return. So your business model has been to spend more time with fewer. As a result of spending more time with fewer, just at the level of generalization before we dive into the detail, if I introduce you tomorrow to a firm that goes through your filtering process, and maybe you can tell us how much filtering you do, I don't know, 1,000 in one investment or whatever it is. What typically are the sort of 2 or 3 things that they're really going to need help with? But first, what is the ratio?
So, I mean, all companies need help. I think one of my very good friends, who's also a co-founder in one of our businesses where I'm on the board, said, no one founder has the 10 things you need to take your company from 0 to 1. So I think the best founders realize that they themselves, in very, very rare circumstances, only could make it. And most founders, even though they're exceptional people, they're not simply superhuman to that extent, and they do need help. So that informs their decision actually to pick a co-founder that's complementary, and there's a great deal of intellectual honesty that's needed to say, here's what I'm not good at, here's what this person is good at, so let me partner with this person, and then apply the same lens to their investor to say, us 2 co-founders, we got 8 out of the 10 covered, but this investor can actually help us cover the other 2. So I think that sort of intellectual honesty and maturity in a founder is very important. We see many times founders that think they can do it alone, and sometimes they may be right, but again, I would argue that it's very much the exception. Sometimes people don't really value the investor. I think there is some people that are a bit more cynical about this. Investors, as you said, just come up, write the check, come to the board meeting, make some intros, and then disappear. We like to think that we can do more than that, and I think founders in today's competitive market should expect more than that. So I think that's the first thing to emphasize. I think the second thing that's also relating to the core of QED is industry expertise. So at QED, we're all ex-operators in some shape or form, and that we believe is also very important. So, I mean, not to say that it's wrong to come from a banking background or a pure consulting background or a pure investing background. All those can lead you to have really valuable insights. But to really understand founders and to really be able to share experiences, if you've been an operator, especially in the area where this company is operating, you can add a lot of value by virtue of having done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, and share that. So we believe in we do less deals per partner per year compared to some other funds, but B, we also focus in areas where we have real expertise and can add value. If we feel like we cannot add value, the hurdle for us to do that deal becomes way, way higher, and it would be very unlikely for us to do it.
Yes, it's interesting because talking about FS over years or decades, it reminded me of a story, which is that back in the day, in the 80s, the then head of fixed income, who I displaced and replaced, he asked me what my view was on the Deutschmark one day. I said I didn't have a view. And he said, you're paid to have a view. We're paying you to have a view. I said, I've got a view on sterling, got a view on dollar, got a view on yen. I've got no idea of the Deutschmark. And he was very cross. Anyway, as I say, so I had the last laugh in that I took over about a year or so later. But in terms of what I did well in investment, it was precisely on this. Sometimes I have no clue whatsoever. Well, I don't play that game. I don't invest in that. But other times, no, look, I'm quite sure that the dollar's quite solid and, and that kind of thing. But that I found in terms of when I was running a department and people coming in, the average person perhaps isn't enough intellectual self-confidence or just self-confidence in the first place to say, haven't got a clue. Because they don't feel they're, really good at Turkish wrestling or music or something like that. I think if somebody's really good at something, they're quite happy at saying, oh, I can't play the flute at all. I'm really good at the guitar. I've found that it's actually quite rare.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we really value intellectual honesty in our founders, and by extension of that, we try to do that ourselves as well. So intellectual honesty about what we're good at and not good at is very important. And we're very open to admit, in the world of fintech, we're way more fin than we are tech. So also, when you go to these, what it takes, the 10 things to go from 0 to 1, the ideal founder for us in many cases is one that's very good at product, very good at tech, knows all that very well, but has some questions about regulation or finance or the lending side of things. Well, that's things that we've been doing for 20, 30, 40 years at a partner level, each one of us. And there we can add a lot of value. So then we become very complementary. So that's also one thing we look for. That's not a rule, by the way, and we don't have rules about these things. But those kind of combinations tend to work out really well because then we're really bringing something to the table and we really look out for those. So we kind of do a bit of lesser deals and be more selective and spend more time with the investments. 2 is like this industry expertise and really bringing that and delivering that for the founders. And then, as you said, 3 is honesty, intellectual honesty, and then one-to-one honesty. So when you speak to founders, it's very easy to say something very typical, go for growth, do this, do that. And the stereotypical answers have a sort of easy way of emerging if you're not careful. But what we try to do is always be very honest with the founders. They may not want to hear what we're saying, but we will say it. And we ask the founders to do the same. If something bad happens, call us. And we have this slogan like Ghostbusters, basically, who are you going to call? When something goes wrong, we pride ourselves that we'd like to think most of the founders would call us first because we'll approach it openly. We don't expect to hear good things only from the founders. We want to be there to solve the problems too. So that level of honesty going both ways is also very important for us.
Yes, and in terms of finding people with these characteristics, it's probably, if you mentioned being married, it's probably a bit like being married or a successful long-term relationship. Before you start talking about what things you need to do to make a relationship successful, the important thing is you need to go out and kiss lots of frogs to find your prince or princess. And if you don't do that process well, then you're massively reducing your chances thereafter. So roughly speaking, how many companies might you look at or QED look at per annum? Do you accept 1 in 2, 1 in 10, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, roughly speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a concrete example from my 4 years in the sort of London office here. So I've done 8 investments over 4 years. Very excited about all 8 of these, and they're all really great in their own way. And to do that, I probably have talked to somewhere from, in serious sort of conversation, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 companies. And then, in any given year, so that averages out to be 2 or so per year, which is a benchmark we have, even though it's not a hard and fast rule. In any given year, there's probably 10 companies I consider very seriously for investment, and then end up basically doing 2 out of those 10 that we're very seriously thinking about. And that is very heartbreaking sometimes, because when you get so close to companies and you're thinking about doing an investment, the temptation is there to do more than 2. But again, to deliver on our promise, and we're one of the few funds that actually do an NPS score on ourselves. In fact, we may be the only one as far as I know.
So NPS meaning?
Net Promoter Score. So we go to all our founders and we ask them, how would you rate QED? Would you recommend us? And so on. And each partner knows sort of what their score is in a way. We keep it anonymous so that nobody really knows in too much detail, but we do it and publicize it for QED as a whole. And to be able to keep that promise and keep that NPS score high, sometimes we need to say no to those 8 that we were so close to and really wanted to invest in, but we can't. And in many cases, there's been companies that I did not invest in, but I still helped a lot. Because once you make it to that sort of top 10 out of a partner's list in a year, I think there's still a very strong attachment and you still go out of your way to help them. So we actually reserve some time, each partner at QED does, to help companies we do not invest in, even though we passed on the investment decision.
Right, okay. At which point it's probably a good time to move on from the kissing frogs and looking for princesses, in case your wife ever listens and asks whether you kiss 999 frogs before finding your princess. But one thing that, I experienced in a different way. So recently I had to go through 350 incoming emails to find half a dozen guests. So that's 2%. But I'm not investing in them. But that's a bit tedious, let alone going into the kind of depth of conversation that you do. So it must be quite challenging, or you must need some personal characteristics or mentality or attitude. Maybe it's just trying to help as many people as you can anyway. to actually have, for the sake of argument, 998 conversations and two, you go, okay, we'll invest in you. Because in a sense, on that process, every day you get up, you're almost bound not to catch a fish. You go fishing every day and twice a year you catch a fish. How does that work psychologically or practically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not for everybody. I think venture capital is a very difficult field to be in, I think. And it's even more difficult to be successful at it. And I'm not going to claim that I'm successful. I mean, I've been doing it for 4 years. Obviously, it's a short time in terms of venture capital. QED has been at it now for 14 years, and I think the track record there is a bit stronger. So we feel a bit more confident claiming that QED definitely is successful in this space. And I think it takes a combination of a lot of different skill sets. So first and foremost, you got to be really interested in businesses and founders and really relate to it. I've started my own business. All the 8 companies I've invested in are way more successful than my business ever was. So that's one thing. And if I were to do it again someday, maybe I will be more successful. Who knows? And many of our founders are repeat founders, so you never know. But I was maybe a decent entrepreneur when I did it, but I certainly wasn't the best. But at least having done it and been through that journey for a period, I know a lot of those challenges. So I find it fascinating to talk to people who are doing that same thing. Even if I'm not going to invest, I could keep doing it. I mean, I was a member of an angel club at one point, and I'd been sort of screening and talking to companies all day, and I was done at work at 7 o'clock, and I went to meet up with my friends in the angel club, and we looked at angel investments from 7 to 10 p.m. And that's sort of when you realize that if you can do that, then you're probably a good candidate for the job.
So you have to have a deep interest in what you're doing, but it's like any domain. If you play baseball and you want to be one of the best baseball players, you need to actually enjoy baseball and the process of training in the gym and all these kind of things. Otherwise, you won't have enough to go the course.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, from my perspective, I cannot think of a job that's more fun or any way to spend my time that's more fun, right? And I think, things happen. I've lived in, I think, 6 countries by now. And if I'd been more settled, or if I'd, grown up in the US and lived there, maybe I would have been an entrepreneur to begin with and never been a VC. Just the way life worked out for me, I started a company once. I've always been interested in being entrepreneurial, but I think, being a VC is absolutely the right balance for me. So I think that's almost, for me, I feel like it's the best of both worlds, where I get to work with entrepreneurs and founders every day, but I do it over such a broad vista that I get these insights that you wouldn't get from just doing one company yourself. You can't say which one is better. I think many times some founders may say that the grass is always greener on the other side. I think both are great. I do also believe that everybody in their life should start a company at least once. And everybody in their life should learn at least one computer language and one foreign language. So if possible, these are things that broaden your horizons that one should do. So I'm fortunate to have done it, and I think that makes me appreciate what I do on a day-to-day basis way much more.
Yes, and I can see that as you've, as it were, sat at all the positions around the round table, having done that, it's so much easier to know what it feels like sitting over there, rather than just, I've only ever sat on this side, and I've met people like you before. It's not a question of that, it's like, oh yes, I've been somebody like you before, and when I did it, I wasn't as good, or something like that. Okay, well, just briefly, having done the overview, if you start a new company tomorrow, there's a whole curve to eventually selling that company, whether it's a trade exit or an IPO or the liquidity event, without which your investors won't get their excitement, because you're not a charity. Investors aren't paying you to have a happy life, interesting life. They're paying you to get the exit. But there's a long journey from we have an idea in a pub tomorrow to we list in 10 years. We've got things like product market fit. Oh, wow, people will buy this. Raspberry and chocolate ice cream. Wow. And then, okay, well, we can make 1 or 2 a week at the moment. How do we make 10? The scaling up phase. And then perhaps the growth phase, which is, as a craft industry, we're now making 50 ice creams a week or 50 gallons. But then we realise that actually, in terms of creating a company that's of a massive value, we need to produce 1,000 gallons. We need to go from being a craft industry to a kind of BMW factory. Then just very briefly, as you see pretty much the whole spectrum, what would your sort of points be that you would wish to share with the audience about these different phases and how that changes things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question, and there's a few different ways to answer it. One is going back to the sort of family analogy. One analogy that I've heard quite often that I quite like is that a new company is a little bit like a child. So, 0 to 1 is extremely vulnerable. If you don't take care of it, actually, it could perish. And that goes for the founders and the investors. Everybody has to take care of it, nurture it. When it gets to be 2-3 years old, now it's like walking, it's moving, it's actually exploring the world, but it doesn't know how dangerous that can be. And it's prone to get into a dangerous accident. So it still needs, in a way, more supervision, but a different kind of supervision. And then as it goes into later stages, 5, 6, 7 years old, you need more people around the table, schools, teachers, other people help you. So I think there's more people around the boardroom, in a sense, at that stage of the life. And then, as I like to joke, once the company hits their teenage years, the PE guys show up in the shiny cars and they drive off and they don't want to talk to you anymore, and you sit at home sort of brokenhearted, right? But so I think that's one way to look at it. The other way is there's a lot of commonalities at each stage. So each stage has a lot of commonalities, but the content of who delivers that need is different. So expertise, yes, you need that at every stage, but the expertise that a partner or a board member or investor provides between sort of the first year of the company to the first 2 years of the company is different than the expertise a board member needs to provide right before the company is going to IPO. So it's still expertise, but it's a different kind of expertise. So in that context, one thing that we do at QED is we have partners with very, very different skill sets and very, very different life and business experiences. Some of us have been through many IPOs. Some of us have been through many scale-ups. Some of us have been at the table many times going from 0 to 1. So at QED, you sort of deliver the whole partnership, and at different points, different people can provide that. The other thing is honesty. You always need the honesty, and I don't think there's different kinds of honesty at the sort of startup stage from 0 to 1 versus at the scale-up versus at the IPO stage, but that's a sort of constant that always needs to be there. So I think all those things are always the same, but they change in sort of a substantive way in terms of how you deliver it. Same goes for industry knowledge. So the industry knowledge you need at a very early stage is much more generalist. You need to do many, many things. So if I'm working with a company that's just been founded, I'm doing all sorts of different things. If I'm working with a company that's more mature, I'll be doing something more specialized to help them as well, probably.
Yes, interesting. Okay, now in terms of the final section before we start wrapping up, going back to this basic point that I mentioned earlier, that most VCs, most angels will say they add value, and they will add some value. But one thing particular about you guys is that you've specifically created an infrastructure, a division, as it were, of QED Investors, whose job is to help people. Maybe you can just explain a little bit about that infrastructure that you've created and the kind of things that you do.
Yeah, so we have a special program that we call QED Belay, and many of the partners work on QED Belay. One of our partners is leading it, and then we have people dedicated to that team, but we all get involved in it. And the view behind QED Belay is basically that we have a special way of working with founders that are at the foundation stage. So basically, if you're just having an idea, or if you just have the passion, and maybe it's two good co-founders that got together and they know they want to start a company in this field, but they want to work out the idea, refine the idea, we can work with them at the foundational stage. And sometimes that involves even helping them find a co-founder, sometimes it doesn't. There's no rules about it, but the main rule is that we get involved at a foundational stage. And even though we normally spend a lot of time with companies, at this stage we spend even more time. So we set up a special sort of way to engage with founders at that foundational stage, and we call that QED Belay. And belay, obviously, as you know, in rock climbing is holding the rope while somebody else is scaling the mountain.
So the point there is that you've got a specific program. You've got one of your partners is in charge of it. His job is to do that well. So it's a function within the company, rather than, as you say, a VC partner might normally sit on half a dozen boards and he quotes adds value, in terms of what he knows, what he's experienced. Good. Okay, so before we wrap up, where is QED going globally or London-wise? What's exciting you about the future?
Yeah, so we've just hired a new partner. Just hired, meaning I think it's been already 6-7 months now, to cover India and Southeast Asia. So we've already done 2 investments in India, which we're very excited about. We're excited about Southeast Asia. We have recently launched a seed stage, very early stage fund focused on Mexico called Fontes. And that's something we're also very excited about. So, when we look at QED, we talk about sort of three ingredients, which is having the founders come to us, seeing the deal flow. Second one being sort of capital, and third one being having the partners and people to cover those and go after those deals and opportunities. At this moment in time, we feel very fortunate to have all three. We're going after all this globally. We've made investments practically across the globe. I've lost track of how many countries, but LATAM, North America, US obviously, Europe, UK, Southeast Asia, and India now. So it's a very exciting time in our journey. So we'd just like to invite all the founders and potential founders and future founders out there to reach out to us, any of us at QED. We've launched a new website now as well, so it's been a bit refreshed. You can see all our contact details there, and we'd love to engage in conversations. And we're specialists, so we specialize in fintech and sort of the fintech side of PropTech and things that are adjacent to fintech. So that specialism, if that appeals to you, and if you're looking forward to working with somebody that is very hands-on and committed, then we just encourage anybody to reach out.
Good. Okay, so before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there and my brand partners of the podcast. Smart is transforming pensions and retirement worldwide. Their leading-edge retirement tech platform propelled them to success in the UK. Now they're operating on 4 continents and working with partners like Zurich and JP Morgan. Find out more at www.smart.co. enlistedboard.com. Resources to help you start making your board an engine of growth today. So you mentioned a little bit about where you're going and what you're after. I mean, one small topic, which is an interesting challenge, and I think particularly for techie type people. It's globalization versus localism. So for the sake of argument, Facebook or Google may look pretty similar around the world. They're very tech. They're not fintech, but I mean, fin obviously varies quite a lot. Equally, you're talking about Sweden and Turkey. If you had a startup in each of those, the business culture is different. There are various kind of things that work in one and the other. America, I always thought, doesn't seem to understand the world particularly well. So one of the things that makes not a lot of sense to me is Americans will talk about Asia and lumping China and India together. I've got a bit of experience of both. Their cultures are very, very different. So how does QED, just briefly, match the globalization, which is similar things are happening around the world in fin and in tech, with localism, which is if you want to do an investment in India or an investment in China, you need people who understand the culture and the context and can judge the people and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it comes down to the people. So we talk about having fintech expertise, but the people that cover each market for us, whether it's Mexico or Brazil or India, are deeply versed in those markets. And we have a saying that, if you're only seeing 80% of the deals in one market, the 20% you're not seeing is probably the best 20%, right? Those are probably the best founders. So we believe in being very deep in markets, and the industry expertise applies equally to geographic and local expertise. And that's why, we tend to be pretty focused on country by country. How we enter a new country is sometimes accidental. Sometimes we get excited about a founder, a theme, an idea, and we do it. It works out. I believe Nubank, that's now, you've probably read a lot in the press about its recent valuations. It is one of our first investments in Brazil, and we're lucky to do that at that point in time. And it's worked out really well. But then, having entered Brazil with Nubank, we've done a lot of other really, really successful investments there in Brazil and in LATAM broadly. So I think, you build up that expertise geographically, and then you sort of stick to those areas where you know the market well. And then sometimes you do have to invest in new markets, but I think you do that very cautiously.
Yes, indeed. It's a kind of spreadsheet. In your rows, you may have payments or lending or something like that. But in your columns, you've got India and you've got China and Sweden, and how it's done varies. And I think one thing that people tend not to appreciate unless they've got international experience of finance, which is that although these days we have things like Basel III, Basel 4, 5, 6, which do apply worldwide, they can apply very differently in different countries. And that finance per se is actually not a thing, but it's a social construct. Hence, fintech in China is very different from fintech in the US, which is quite different from the UK, which is quite different from Europe. But I guess that just adds to the interest of doing it. If it was completely homogeneous, it'd be a fairly sort of dull world. So before we wave goodbye to the audience, is there anything else that we haven't particularly covered about the topic or QED that springs to mind, Yusuf?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. Obviously, it's hard to get to know any one topic in a short period of time, but hopefully this has been helpful. Yeah, and thanks a lot for hosting me here, Mike.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. I had forgotten if I ever knew it, the connection between Capital One and QED, and you've been very modest, because I remember back in the day, talking 1980s, Kleinworts had an early stage investment unit. And in terms of the famous Top Gear phrase, how hard can it be? Very early stage investment is much harder than you can imagine. However, results speak for themselves, and I think this shows that one of the things that QED has been successful is adding value. Because no way, if you're a monkey walking to casino, throwing some chips at the roulette wheel of early stages, are you going to get anything like 2/3 of those win somewhat? So it's a great job you guys have been doing, and long may it continue. And thank you for sharing yourself some insights into your world, which I hope will help the listeners at whatever stage they're at. And you can also, I'm sure, reach out to QED, and if you're very lucky, maybe you'll get their help one day and be one of their unicorns. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for listening. If you're in need of a non-executive or advisory director with deep expertise, experience and contacts in the worlds of both traditional FS and fintech, or unique insight into how to make your board an engine of growth today, contact me at mike@mikeballiman.com. If you just need one-off advice in these areas, via clarity.fm/mikeballiman.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.